3 polished mahogany caskets sit side by side in a heavy, incense-filled church. Inside lie a father, a mother, and an 18-year-old girl, all victims of a calculated massacre. At the podium stands the sole survivor. His face is pale, streaked with genuine tears. He grips the microphone and sings a breathtakingly beautiful eulogy. The congregation weeps, pitying the orphaned son, but their grief is entirely misplaced. The young man singing this hymn is not a tragic survivor. He is the architect of the slaughter, staring down at the wooden boxes containing the bloodline he butchered with his own hands. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Teddy and Mary Loiva Gonzales did not just want a better life when they relocated from the Philippines to the affluent, sun-baked suburbs of Sydney, Australia. They demanded an exceptional one. Teddy was a man of relentless, almost clinical ambition. He had been a highly respected lawyer in his home country, and upon arriving on foreign soil, he absolutely refused to settle for the struggles of a typical immigrant. He rebuilt his career from the ground up, establishing a wildly lucrative immigration law practice and amassing a formidable real estate portfolio. Mary Loiva was his equal in drive, a woman who meticulously managed their social standing, ensuring the family projected an image of absolute, unshakable prestige. Their 2-story brick home on a quiet, manicured street was a fortress of traditional values. The air inside always smelled faintly of lemon polish and expensive incense, a physical manifestation of Mary Loiva's demand for perfection. But beneath the polished surfaces, the walls hummed with immense, suffocating pressure. The parents' love was undeniable, yet it was deeply transactional, tethered exclusively to academic excellence and flawless public behavior. In this high-stakes environment, 18-year-old Claudine thrived. She was the genuine, perfect child, a living monument to her parents' sacrifices. Claudine was a gifted student, a talented pianist, and unconditionally obedient to the punishingly strict curfews laid down by her father. The house often echoed with the crisp, precise notes of her evening piano practice. It was a sound that brought Teddy and Mary Loiva immense comfort. She was on a direct, unwavering trajectory toward a prestigious career. Claudine was the golden investment that was paying off exactly as planned. Then there was the firstborn, the only son, 20-year-old Sef. In their traditional household, the eldest son carried the crushing weight of the family legacy. He was the heir apparent, expected to eventually take the reins of the patriarch's empire. Teddy had mapped out Sef's entire existence before the boy could even speak. He was ordered to study medicine, become a top-tier physician, and elevate the Gonzales name to even greater societal heights. But Sef was not built like Claudine. He possessed a sharp mind, but it was entirely disconnected from the grueling discipline of medical school. He craved the aesthetics of wealth, the sleek sports cars, the designer clothes, the effortless respect of his peers. But he despised the relentless labor required to actually earn it. The friction between father and son was constant. It was a low-grade tremor that continuously threatened the foundation of their home. Teddy did not negotiate. Every dropped grade, every missed expectation was met with harsh reprimands, revoked privileges, and the ultimate threat: complete financial excommunication. The Gonzales household became an arena of quiet, cold warfare. Upstairs, Claudine studied tirelessly under the warm glow of parental approval. Downstairs, Sef sat in the heavy, freezing shadow of an impossible standard. His father's demands felt less like guidance and more like a tightening noose. The family's pursuit of excellence had created a beautiful, gleaming facade, completely blinding them to the dark, malignant resentment silently festering in the mind of the perfect son. The University of New South Wales was supposed to be the prestigious proving ground for the family's heir. Enrolled in rigorous medical science courses, the young man was expected to easily transition into a highly respected, high-earning profession. but the sprawling campus lecture halls rarely saw him. While his younger sister remained at home, dutifully perfecting complex piano sonatas and studying late into the night, the older brother was carefully constructing an elaborate, full-time double life. He spent his days wandering the affluent commercial districts of Sydney, playing the role of a carefree, wealthy playboy. He cultivated an image of effortless superiority among his peers, spending hours lounging in high-end cafes, buying rounds of drinks, and purchasing designer clothing he had absolutely no way of legitimately affording. He was thoroughly addicted to the aesthetics of high society, but utterly allergic to the grueling labor required to actually belong there. To fund this relentless charade, the young man began quietly siphoning money from his parents' accounts. It started small, funds supposedly earmarked for expensive medical textbooks, and university fees were diverted straight into his personal wardrobe and his bustling social life. He eventually resorted to pawning pieces of his mother's expensive jewelry and manipulating stolen credit cards. A significant portion of this illicit capital went toward maintaining a relationship with a young woman he was desperately trying to impress. He knew with absolute certainty that if the illusion of his immense wealth evaporated, his social standing and his romantic life would collapse immediately alongside it. Simultaneously, the patriarch of the family demanded constant proof of academic excellence. The son delivered exactly what was asked of him, just not legitimately. He transformed his quiet bedroom into a highly efficient forgery workshop. Utilizing consumer editing software and high-quality cardstock, he meticulously altered his failing university transcripts. He erased his abysmal failing grades and replaced them with top-tier marks, carefully matching the institution's typography and duplicating the official university crest. When he handed these falsified documents to his father, he played the part of the dutiful student flawlessly. He accepted his parents' proud praise with a modest smile, entirely unfazed by the staggering weight of his own deception. For a long time, the counterfeit reality held. The family celebrated his fabricated achievements, completely unaware that their golden boy was actually facing severe academic probation and impending expulsion. But his appetite for luxury was growing far too rapidly, significantly outpacing his ability to steal unnoticed. He desperately wanted a new, aggressively expensive sports car, a physical status symbol to permanently cement his fabricated image. He began heavily pressuring his family to purchase it for him, aggressively citing his stellar, though completely forged, academic record as leverage. This relentless demand for capital proved to be his fatal error. The father, a man whose entire self-made fortune was built on a foundation of meticulous attention to legal and financial details, finally began to notice the undeniable discrepancies. The numbers were simply not aligning. The exact moment the illusion shattered was catastrophic for the household. Investigating the persistent financial irregularities, the patriarch contacted the university administration directly, effectively bypassing the carefully manufactured paper trail. The truth hit the family home with the concussive force of a detonating bomb. The father discovered that not only was his son failing miserably, but the entire academic portfolio was a calculated multi-year fraud. The boy was not a medical prodigy, he was an academic ghost. Furthermore, the missing household funds were tracked directly to his extravagant, unauthorized lifestyle. The resulting confrontation permanently poisoned the atmosphere of the house. The father did not merely scold his son, he systematically dismantled his entire existence. Through cold, uncompromising ultimatums, Teddy made his intentions brutally clear. The financial pipeline was permanently severed. The luxury car was immediately denied. The generous allowance was permanently terminated. Furthermore, the patriarch issued the ultimate unforgivable sanction. He intended to legally disinherit his firstborn. The vast real estate empire, the lucrative law practice, the millions in accumulated savings. All of it would bypass the son entirely and be handed down exclusively to the obedient, genuinely successful sister. The young man was coldly informed that he would soon have to pack his bags, leave the comfortable suburban fortress, and survive entirely on his own. For a narcissist abruptly stripped of his supply, desperation rapidly ferments into something highly toxic. He found himself backed into an impossible, suffocating corner. If he was cast out, his girlfriend would inevitably leave him. His peers would discover his absolute failure. He would be reduced to a menial, blue-collar existence, a fate he genuinely considered worse than death. The environment inside the brick home became a psychological prison. Meals were eaten in suffocating silence. His car keys were confiscated, and his movements were strictly monitored. As he sat in his freezing shadow, listening to the muffled, perfect notes of his sister practicing the piano downstairs, his resentment mutated into clinical, unadulterated malice. He did not feel an ounce of remorse for his lies. Instead, he felt an intense, burning hatred toward his father for withdrawing the funds he believed were his divine birthright. In his twisted psychological framework, the problem was not his own deceit. It was his parents' control over the bank accounts. And his sister was no longer family. She was a financial rival who was about to steal his empire. If the patriarch successfully altered the will, the money would be lost forever. However, if the parents were to suddenly pass away before those complex legal documents could be officially changed, the original will would stand. As the sole surviving son, he would automatically inherit everything. A chillingly pragmatic thought took root in the dark corners of his mind. He began quietly utilizing the household computer to research lethal poisons and toxic plants, searching for a quiet, untraceable way to erase his bloodline. He stopped viewing his mother, father, and sister as human beings. They were simply breathing obstacles, standing between him and a $6 million inheritance. The walls were closing in, and the perfect son decided the only way to escape was to butcher his way out. Tuesday, July 10th, 2001. The air outside the affluent suburban fortress was crisp, hovering steadily around 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the sprawling two-story brick home, the environment was perfectly still. The 20-year-old son stood alone in the center of the pristine kitchen, surrounded by the expensive imported appliances his parents had sacrificed decades to acquire. He moved toward a heavy wooden block on the granite countertop. The sharp, metallic scrape of steel against wood broke the absolute silence as he extracted two long, heavy carving knives, each boasting an 8-inch serrated blade. Next, he retrieved a solid 30-inch wooden baseball bat from a storage closet. He carried these items into the front foyer, his footsteps muffled by the thick, expensive Persian rugs. He carefully staged the weapons in the deep shadows near the base of the grand wooden staircase. The young man was no longer a failing university student, terrified of his father's wrath. He had transformed himself into a predator, waiting patiently in a blind. At approximately 4:30 p.m., the front lock clicked. The heavy oak door swung inward. The 18-year-old sister stepped into the foyer, dropping her heavy school backpack onto the polished hardwood floor. She kicked off her shoes, her mind likely focused on her rigid evening piano practice schedule or upcoming university exams. As she walked toward the center of the house, the perpetrator stepped out from the blind spot near the stairs. He raised the wooden bat and brought it down with concussive, devastating force. The impact was deafening in the quiet house, but the first strike was not lethal. The young woman screamed, spinning around to face her attacker. The mild confusion in her eyes instantly morphed into sheer, unadulterated terror as she recognized the face of her own brother. She fought back with feral intensity. The struggle spilled violently from the elegant hallway into the adjacent study. She clawed, kicked, and desperately tried to block the ensuing blows with her bare arms. The physical reality of murder is rarely as clean or efficient as it appears on television. It is exhausting, chaotic, and incredibly loud. Realizing the blunt force trauma was insufficient to silence her quickly enough, the perpetrator dropped the bloodied bat. He reached into his waistband and produced one of the kitchen knives. The pacing of the attack immediately shifted from blunt, frantic aggression to lethal, mechanical precision. He drove the blade forward. The ensuing wounds to her neck and chest were catastrophic. After a prolonged, desperate fight for her own survival, the genuine, perfect child of the family collapsed onto the carpet. The perpetrator stood over her, his chest heaving heavily, adrenaline surging through his veins. He did not panic. He did not reach for a telephone. He simply bent down, grasped his sister's lifeless body, and callously dragged her further into the study, concealing her completely from the front entryway. The house fell back into a suffocating, heavy silence. The sharp, metallic smell of copper began to mingle deeply with the faint, ever-present scent of lemon furniture polish. The perpetrator walked to the downstairs bathroom. He turned on the brass faucet, watching the pale red water swirl down the porcelain drain as he meticulously washed his hands. He checked his watch. It was roughly 5:30 p.m. He retrieved the second carving knife from the shadows. He returned to his position in the foyer. He waited. The distinct sound of a vehicle pulling into the driveway signaled the arrival of the second target. The mother unlocked the front door, her arms likely burdened with work documents or evening groceries. She stepped into the dim entryway, immediately calling out to the house. No response came. She took a few steps inward, her eyes struggling to adjust to the low indoor light. She noticed the dark, wet smears streaked across the hardwood floor. Before her brain could fully process the horrific scene, her son lunged from the darkness. This second ambush was completely devoid of hesitation. The perpetrator attacked with a ferocity that bordered on the clinical. The mother had absolutely no time to defend herself, drop her bags, or comprehend that her executioner was the child she had carried and raised. The blade struck with devastating speed. The attack was concentrated entirely on her throat and upper torso, severing major arteries in a matter of milliseconds. She fell heavily to the floor in the hallway, the life draining from her body almost instantly. The killer stood above the woman who gave him life, his face locked in a mask devoid of any human empathy. He was no longer looking at a mother. He was simply executing a necessary financial transaction. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the blood-soaked floors. The ambient temperature dropped. Inside, the perpetrator sat quietly in the encroaching darkness. He did not turn on the overhead lights, knowing that sudden illumination would entirely ruin the final, most crucial ambush. He waited in the pitch-black house for over an hour. This intermission required a chilling, almost psychopathic level of psychological detachment. He was sitting mere feet from the butchered remains of his family, yet his heart rate likely steadied. He simply gripped the handle of the remaining knife, his muscles cramping from the immense physical exertion of the previous violence, his mind fixated entirely on the $6 million estate waiting at the finish line. At 6:50 p.m., the heavy, authoritative footsteps of the patriarch echoed loudly on the front porch. The brass lock turned. Teddy pushed the door open, stepping into the pitch-black foyer. He reached blindly for the wall switch. The sun struck before the artificial light could expose the slaughter. The father was a formidable man, highly driven, physically strong, and deeply authoritarian. When the first thrust of the blade pierced his chest, he did not immediately fall. A brutal, agonizing struggle erupted in the confined space of the entryway. Teddy realized instantly he was fighting for his life, though the absolute darkness obscured the identity of his attacker. He grabbed the serrated blade with his bare hands, desperately trying to wrestle the weapon away from his assailant. The defensive wounds inflicted on his palms and fingers were horrific, the steel cutting straight through tendons and scraping against bone as he fought the relentless, driving assault. But the son pushed forward, fueled by 3 years of festering, toxic resentment and the looming, terrifying threat of a blue-collar existence. He drove the patriarch backward, overpowering the older man through the sheer violent advantage of the initial ambush. The father's resistance began to fade rapidly as massive blood loss took its inevitable toll. A final, devastating thrust targeted the neck, severing the spinal cord completely. The patriarch collapsed onto the floor, his heavy frame coming to rest near the entryway. The long, silent psychological war within the brick house had concluded in less than 3 hours. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. The perpetrator stood alone in the dark. His breathing was ragged, his clothing completely soaked in the heavy evidence of his unimaginable betrayal. But his work was far from finished. He needed a narrative, a fabricated, highly visible story to hand directly to the local police. He walked to a utility closet and retrieved a can of spray paint. He moved toward a pristine, light-colored wall in the main living area. He shook the can. The metallic rattle of the mixing ball inside echoed sharply through the tomb-like house. He pressed the nozzle and painted a massive, aggressive racial slur across the drywall. It was a calculated, highly theatrical red herring. By staging the horrific scene as a violent, targeted hate crime, he fully intended to manipulate the detectives into chasing phantom extremists, ensuring they would look everywhere except at the weeping, orphaned survivor. The staging complete, the young man moved with terrifying efficiency. He stripped off his ruined clothing, gathering the blood-soaked garments, the leather shoes, the wooden bat, and the 2 carving knives. He stuffed them all into a heavy-duty plastic garbage bag. He walked back to the downstairs bathroom, quickly washing the remaining physical evidence from his face and arms. He dressed in clean, highly fashionable clothes, pulled from his upstairs bedroom. He picked up the heavy garbage bag, stepped out the back door into the freezing night air, and quietly locked the house behind him. He walked to his vehicle, placed the evidence bag deep in the trunk, and started the engine. He did not look back at the suburban fortress. Instead, he drove directly toward the neon lights of the city, intending to spend the next several hours wandering through crowded arcades and bustling entertainment districts. He was about to begin the performance of a lifetime, meticulously constructing an airtight, time-stamped alibi while his entire bloodline lay slowly cooling on the hardwood floors. He walked through the front door, stepping over the cold remains of his family, and reached for the telephone. The ensuing call to emergency services was a masterclass in calculated theatrical hysteria. He hyperventilated heavily into the receiver, his voice cracking with manufactured terror as he informed the dispatcher that he had just walked into a nightmare. He wailed uncontrollably, insisting through simulated sobs that his parents and sister were covered in blood, and that he did not know if the armed intruders were still hiding inside the sprawling house. The dispatcher, hearing the primal, escalating panic of a seemingly traumatized survivor, immediately ordered him to flee the premises and dispatched multiple patrol units and ambulances to the address. When the first responders arrived with sirens blaring, they found the young man waiting outside on the manicured lawn. He was trembling violently, clutching his head in his hands and dry heaving into the grass. Inside the residence, seasoned law enforcement officers were physically repulsed by the sheer, unadulterated brutality of the scene. The heavy, metallic scent of iron hung thick and stagnant in the air, completely overpowering the household's usual smell of expensive cleaning supplies. The pristine walls were heavily compromised by arterial spray. The massive, aggressively painted racial slur in the living room immediately commanded the detectives' full attention. The initial assessment pointed entirely away from domestic violence. The staggering scale of the slaughter, combined with the offensive graffiti, suggested a highly coordinated, lightning-fast attack by multiple perpetrators, most likely an extremist hate group targeting successful minority immigrants. News of the massacre spread through the affluent community like a seismic shockwave. This was a neighborhood defined by its exceptionally low crime rates, luxury vehicles, and meticulously manicured lawns. The sudden, violent extermination of an entire household shattered the fragile illusion of suburban safety. Absolute panic set in overnight. Rumors circulated wildly among the residents that a roaming, racially motivated kill squad was actively operating in their zip code. local hardware stores completely sold out of heavy deadbolts, motion sensor lights, and high-end alarm systems within hours. Families who had comfortably lived with their doors unlocked for decades suddenly barricaded themselves inside. Children were abruptly pulled from after-school activities, and the usual evening neighborhood walks ceased entirely. The fear in the community was palpable, thick, and suffocating. The residents rallied fiercely around the sole surviving son, universally viewing him as a tragic, orphaned victim who had escaped the exact same horrific fate by sheer blind luck. The young man absorbed this massive wave of public sympathy and weaponized it flawlessly. He stepped directly into the glaring media spotlight, willingly granting highly publicized interviews to local and national television stations. Standing in front of a battery of news cameras, his eyes appropriately red and swollen, he delivered a chillingly convincing performance. He begged the anonymous killers to come forward, pleading with the public to provide any information that might lead to justice for his slaughtered relatives. He articulated his immense, crushing grief, stating that his future had been completely destroyed and that he felt entirely hollowed out by the unimaginable loss. Viewers sitting in their living rooms across the country wept openly for him. His elaborate performance reached its absolute zenith during the joint funeral service. The massive church was packed far beyond its fire code capacity, with terrified neighbors, grieving classmates, and sympathetic strangers. The 3 heavy wooden caskets sat prominently at the front of the altar, surrounded by hundreds of expensive floral arrangements. When the time came for the eulogy, the young man slowly walked up the central aisle, leaning heavily on the shoulders of extended relatives as if he could barely support his own weight. He took the microphone, and instead of simply reading a prepared statement, he sang a delicate, breathtakingly mournful hymn. His voice was remarkably steady, hitting every note with deep, emotive resonance. The entire congregation broke down. The raw sound of collective sobbing echoed loudly off the vaulted ceiling. He stood there, looking down at the boxes containing the people he had personally butchered, soaking in the absolute adoration and profound, misguided pity of the massive crowd. He had successfully convinced the entire world that he was a victim. He believed his multi-million-dollar inheritance was completely secure, and that the police were actively chasing phantoms. He felt utterly, terrifyingly invincible. The initial weeks of the investigation were an exercise in immense, grinding frustration for the local homicide squad. They were staring at a sprawling suburban crime scene that made absolutely no logical sense. The sheer brutality of the 3 murders, coupled with the massive, aggressively spray-painted racial slur dominating the living room wall, initially forced the detectives to look outward. Operating on the assumption that the theatrical staging was genuine, the police department poured thousands of man-hours into chasing phantoms. They rigorously tracked local extremist groups, interviewed informants, and scoured the affluent zip code for any signs of a roaming, highly organized kill squad. The community remained trapped in a state of suffocating panic, with neighbors continuing to barricade themselves indoors, terrified that the xenophobic murderers would return. Concurrently, investigators dug deeply into the patriarch's lucrative professional life. Sef Gonzales was a formidable immigration attorney and a wealthy real estate mogul. He routinely dealt with large sums of money, complex legal disputes, and occasionally deeply disgruntled clients facing deportation. Detectives painstakingly built profiles on business rivals, former partners, and anyone who might harbor a violent, simmering grudge against the family. But every single promising lead quickly evaporated into nothing. The extremist groups had no footprint in the manicured neighborhood, and Teddy's professional rivals all possessed ironclad, verified alibis. The red herrings were slowly blinding the investigation. The critical turning point occurred when seasoned investigators deliberately stepped back from the noisy, theatrical elements of the crime scene and focused purely on the cold, physical logic of the brick house. The narrative of a random, racially motivated hate crime was beginning to heavily fracture under the weight of basic common sense. Hate crimes are overwhelmingly fast, chaotic, and emotionally explosive. The perpetrators breach a location, inflict massive damage, and immediately flee to avoid capture. But the killer inside the Gonzales home had been terrifyingly, unnaturally patient. There was absolutely no sign of forced entry on any of the heavy oak doors or first-floor windows, meaning the executioner either possessed a key or was freely let inside by the victims themselves. Furthermore, the medical examiner's analysis of blood coagulation and pooling indicated the murders were not a simultaneous blitz. The killer had violently ambushed the 18-year-old sister, successfully hidden her body, and then simply waited. He ambushed the mother and then waited again in the pitch-black house for over an hour for the father to return from work. This level of methodical, icy patience pointed directly away from chaotic extremists and strongly toward an individual intimately familiar with the family's exact daily schedule. The investigative spotlight slowly, inevitably, swiveled away from the terrified community and locked directly onto the grieving, orphaned son. He had confidently provided detectives with a seemingly bulletproof, time-stamped timeline, heavily supported by crumpled convenience store receipts and witness sightings at a crowded, deafeningly loud downtown arcade. However, forensic pathology systematically dismantled his entire story. Based on the victim's stomach contents, the ambient indoor temperature of the climate-controlled house, and the established routine arrival times of the mother and sister, the medical examiner drastically narrowed the exact window of the massacre. The extreme violence had occurred strictly between 4:30 p.m. and 7 p.m. The surviving son's meticulously documented arcade visit, the core of his airtight defense, did not actually begin until nearly 8 p.m. He had effectively provided a flawless alibi for the aftermath of the crime, but his whereabouts during the actual slaughter were entirely unaccounted for. When veteran detectives sat him down in a sterile interrogation room and gently pressed him on this massive, glaring discrepancy, his carefully constructed calm faltered. His breathing shallowed, his eyes darted, and his explanations became increasingly convoluted, shifting from a confident narrative to a stuttering mess of contradictions. As the timeline shattered, the physical evidence began pointing exclusively, damningly inward. Forensic technicians analyzing the massive racial slur in the living room determined the exact chemical composition and brand of the paint. It was not an exotic aerosol brought into the house by a roaming gang. The chemical signature perfectly matched a half-empty can of spray paint found discarded deep inside the family's own utility closet. The killer had utilized the household's own supplies to manufacture the hate crime illusion. But the absolute most devastating piece of evidence was pulled directly from the digital ether. Cyber investigators seized the Gonzales family computer from the upstairs study and conducted a deep, exhaustive forensic dive into the hard drive. They bypassed the standard, easily cleared browsing history and recovered heavily deleted search logs tied specifically to the 20-year-old son's personal user profile. In the weeks immediately preceding the massacre, the young man had not been studying for his fabricated medical exams. He had been obsessively scouring the internet for untraceable lethal poisons, toxic plants, and silent methods for erasing a human life. This digital footprint definitively proved intense premeditation. He had originally intended to poison his bloodline quietly, before his desperation forced him to resort to blunt force and serrated kitchen steel. If the mounting physical and digital evidence formed the foundation of his legal ruin, the young man's own staggering clinical arrogance provided the final nail. He genuinely believed he had successfully outsmarted the veteran homicide detectives. He assumed the mask of the weeping orphan had rendered him completely untouchable. Just days after publicly sobbing over his family's caskets and delivering that breathtaking, widely televised eulogy, he marched directly into a high-end luxury car dealership. He confidently ordered the exact same aggressively expensive sports car his slaughtered father had explicitly denied him weeks earlier. To secure the massive financial loan, he casually offered his impending $6 million inheritance as official collateral. He also began actively contacting real estate agents, inquiring about rapidly selling the sprawling suburban fortress where his parents and sister had just bled to death. There was absolutely no mourning period, no trauma, only a frantic, cold-blooded rush to liquidate the newly acquired assets. The detectives, quietly monitoring his every financial move and phone call, realized with absolute certainty that they were not dealing with a traumatized survivor. They were tracking a highly narcissistic apex predator who had systematically butchered his own family simply to gain unfettered access to their bank accounts. The net was fully closed. The arrest was completely devoid of the theatricality the young man craved. In June 2002, detectives quietly approached him in a public space. There were no flashing lights or screaming sirens, just the cold, heavy click of steel handcuffs closing around his wrists. He did not fight back. The performance was finally over. Inside the sterile courtroom, the meticulously constructed facade of the weeping orphan disintegrated completely. Prosecutors methodically laid out the undeniable physical and digital evidence, painting a stark clinical portrait of a narcissistic predator who viewed his own family entirely as financial assets to be aggressively liquidated. The defendant sat at the heavy wooden table, his face locked in a rigid, emotionless mask as his fabricated reality entirely collapsed around him. The legal resolution struck the exact nerve he had killed to protect. Under the state's strict forfeiture laws, a murderer cannot legally profit from their violent crimes. The entire $6 million estate, the lucrative business assets, the sprawling properties, the heavily guarded savings, was permanently stripped from his grasp and redirected to extended relatives. He had systematically butchered his bloodline for absolutely nothing. The presiding judge handed down the absolute maximum penalty available. The young man was sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of life imprisonment, accompanied by a strict judicial stipulation firmly denying any future possibility of parole. He was officially permanently removed from society, condemned to sit in a highly monitored, maximum security concrete cell for the remainder of his natural life. The sprawling brick home in the affluent suburbs was eventually scrubbed clean, the heavy Persian rugs replaced, the walls repainted. It was sold to strangers who likely never knew the true depth of the horror that occurred in the foyer. The pursuit of absolute perfection created a monster who valued a bank account over the very people who gave him life. He sits today in a concrete cell, stripped of his name, his inheritance, and his freedom. The perfect son became the perfect executioner. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.